be fiercely protective of your time. So if you don't decide what you're going to do with your time, someone else will.
What are a few things that you would point to from that lens of supporting new managers and being able to kind of scale this across the company?
I think one of the first most important things is to reframe tasks and to-do lists. People are like, oh, I've got so much on my to-do list, I'm never going to get to my project work. And I like to say a to-do list is proof of life. If you're a busy professional human, you're going to have stuff on your to-do list. You're never going to get to the bottom of it.
People like to say, have a good day. And it's a nice sentiment, but it's a fixed perspective that can put a lot of pressure on us. It's also really hard to define from person to person. What about instead if we ask ourselves, how can I have a better day? At work, at home, in life? That's what this show is all about. The Have a Better Day podcast comes to you from Boon, a personalized coaching platform that helps businesses everywhere to support the whole humans, which are their employees. We have our pulse on what employees are dealing with in today's workplace, and we want to share those insights with you. Welcome to the Have a Better Day podcast.
So here at Boon, we feel like we have our pulse on what's going on in today's workplace, primarily through coaches like Rumina, who are talking to employees every day about the most pressing challenges that they're having in the workplace. And through our conversations with Rumina and the HR leaders and CEOs that we're working with, one of the most pressing challenges that we continue to hear about is individual contributors who have been doing an amazing job in their previous roles, promoted into new managerial capacity or new leadership capacity in some form or fashion. And there is a huge change in the day-to-day that takes place from being an individual contributor to being a new manager. And there's not really a clear playbook on how to take care of this as a new manager. We want to be that resource and guide for employees and bring more light to that conversation. So I feel really lucky today to have Rumina here, who's an amazing Boon coach, as well as a former physician and filmmaker. So she checks all of the boxes and has a really unique perspective on the way these challenges are showing up in the workplace today. So Rumina, really happy to have you.
Thanks, Alex. I'm delighted to be here.
So, Rumina, can you start by maybe just telling us a little bit about, and I guess I should preface this with the fact that I have a dermatologist as a wife, and I just find your background as a physician turned leadership coach to be so interesting. I guess maybe just starting for the audience, just a little bit more about your journey from the medical life to leadership coaching and how that came to be.
Yeah, sure, Alex. I'd be delighted to. So I am an ER physician by original trade. I was UK trained and I've always had a creative side. So after med school, I went to film school and I have a master's in film production. And I used that to make health education films. So I was really lucky, had a lot of fun, made Bollywood-style comedies to teach the UK's Asian communities about things like heart disease and diabetes. And I promise this does eventually get us to coaching. What happened then is I did a lot of community outreach, and I found that over the years, I would spend hours at the end of community outreach sessions. We'd talk about health, and then I'd just be essentially health coaching people at the end of these meetings. And so about 8 years or so ago, when I moved to Seattle, Washington, which is where I'm based now, I trained officially as a coach. And I thought, I'm going to be a health and wellness coach because I'm a physician. But it became clear really quickly. And over the years, my practice has really developed into coaching professionals. So I coach leaders, emerging leaders, and a lot of physicians just because that's who I know as well.
Yeah.
And that's my coaching practice, is coaching professionals about their personal life and about their work life. So that's kind of how I got there.
Super interesting. And I guess was there like a specific experience or something that led you to, I guess, focusing even more so around this topic of new managers transitioning effectively into their new role, whether it be physicians or in the normal workplace?
Yes, I think what I was seeing a lot was starting with physicians and then with individual contributors in workplaces as well, that these guys are brilliant subject matter experts. So you're really good at your job and you really know your stuff. And one day you just get told, oh, you're so good at what you do, you're going to be a people manager now, or you're going to be in a leadership position, without ever really being given the education or the tools to do it. So we found these amazingly intelligent people who are really good at what they do, just flung into the deep end and told to sink or swim, and often reinventing the wheel or just sinking or just trying to figure it out as they go along. And it just felt like a really good space to work with people on actually accelerating that, getting to know yourself as a leader and getting to know what leadership is and how to do it.
And when you say deep end, what are some of the most common challenges that you are coming across when, you're just getting kind of thrown to the wolves and figure it out for yourself? Like, what are some of the most common struggles you run into? And I guess some background on that, this is probably near the top of what we hear from HR leaders when we're working with customers at Boone today is, I have a new manager that's thrust into a new role. We don't necessarily have the infrastructure to train them on. I'll let you talk through the different challenges that you're working through, but this topic seems to just be such a hot button for people leaders and CEOs that we're talking to across the board.
Yeah, I can imagine that. And there are lots of things that we see that I'm seeing every day coaching people who are flung into these positions. Everything from that imposter syndrome, what am I doing here? I have no idea what I'm doing. How am I going to do it? To not even really knowing the language of leadership. So what types of leadership are there? How do you do it? What is a one-to-one? What do I do when I'm mentoring or coaching somebody? To this really big one of, I have completely shifted gears now. So I was doing this really nitty-gritty stuff in the weeds, and now I have to take this high-level view. And we often find that new leaders are trying to juggle, still doing what they were doing before with adding in this leadership stuff, still putting out fires, emails and Slacks and all sorts of things, and just never really getting to the leadership. So saying, I was hired to be strategic and do all this really cool, fun project stuff and have a vision for my organization, but I never even get the chance to do it. So that's often a really big challenge.
Yeah. And I was going to ask, how can an overemphasis on task completion really hinder a new manager's ability to lead effectively? And I think kind of a corollary to that, we actually just did an episode around limiting beliefs and the role that can play in the workplace. And I feel like that can tie so well into this topic in particular. I mean, you mentioned imposter syndrome. How much of that overemphasis on task completion actually comes from that feeling of limiting beliefs around ability to lead, and how it's kind of turns into this vicious cycle?
I think a lot of it comes from feeling you have to do everything and you have to get it all done. Otherwise, you haven't done a good job. And often prioritizing tasks that other people give you to do, because that gives you some kind of validation. Someone asked me to do this and I've done it. They know I've done it, and now I know I've done it and I can check it off my list. But of course, that means you never get to the real stuff that you really want to do, your own personal projects. So I think one of the first most important things is to reframe tasks and to-do lists. Yeah. People are like, oh, I've got so much on my to-do list, I'm never going to get to my project work. And I like to say a to-do list is proof of life. If you're a busy professional human, you're going to have stuff on your to-do list. You're never going to get to the bottom of it. And that's probably got to be seen as a healthy, good thing. So what I like to do is talk to people about reframing it as a to-day list. So look at success around what you're going to do today. So today, it's 8 a.m. I'm going to look at my to-do list and look at that and say, what are those things am I going to do today? That will be success today. But in amongst that, you actually need to balance doing your own thing. So it's not just emails and Slacks and you've got a bill to pay or something else has landed on your plate and someone wants you to appear in a meeting, but actually saying, okay, I was hired to do this strategic stuff and I'm going to spend some time today on it. No matter what, I'm going to be really fiercely protective of half an hour or 2 hours or whatever your job allows, and actually move that forward as well. So those tasks, just easy to do, to tick off your list, but that means you never get to the real meaty stuff.
Yeah. And I mean, you kind of started touching on some relevant use cases around like what managers can do instead of starting to, literally just go through their entire to-do list. I guess, can you maybe just walk us through like a real world example of maybe a Boone client, obviously, maintaining confidentiality, but a Boone client that you were working with and just kind of telling a narrative for the audience around, this was how this challenge presented itself. Here's how we worked through that transition. And maybe along with that, like, what are some principles that you believe were so foundational to being able to achieve that success in that transition?
Yeah. One several clients spring to mind, but one in particular, she is a seasoned leader, but was pushed into an even more senior leadership role and found herself, like I think I alluded to before, doing two jobs. So doing the old one and the new one, was completely swamped. And when we first met, she spoke at about 300 miles an hour because she was just so kind of put upon and stressed out. I was very grateful that she was able to even make the time to have a 30-minute conversation with a coach. We worked together a lot on making sure she was really strict about dedicating some time to her new leadership role. So it was clear her job was really busy with lots of deadlines and lots going on, and she had to make a lot of decisions. So you have to work within the structure of your own organization. You can't say, well, I'm going to take half a day every day and just do my deep work. She couldn't do that. So we were like, what are the small wins? So she said, okay, well, if I look at my diary, I've got half an hour here, right? You're going to put in that it's a meeting. So you're going to say it's a meeting. So it's sacred. You're going to ring fence it and be protective of it. And I say, if you were in the dentist chair, you wouldn't say, oh, but you can still Slack me and email me. You've got to treat it as you would treat either a meeting with someone else or something really important that just takes you away from your laptop and your screen and other people so you can focus on that work.
Yeah.
Delegating was a really big one as well. So how do you delegate? So learning that skill, learning not to feel guilty about it or feel like you're a failure because you're having to delegate, but actually seeing it as an opportunity for someone else. So someone you're now managing and leading is going to get the opportunity to do a task you know how to do and they don't know how to do it yet. So you're giving them this gift of, you're going to do this. I'll oversee it or I'll help you and I'm still here, but you're going to learn how to do it now. So learning that delegation is not a cop-out or a bad thing. And we also culled extraneous meetings. So I think since the world has moved so much to virtual communication, Zooms and meetings are everywhere now. Everyone's has their time put upon. People say to me, I'm a grown-up and I'm at work and someone puts a meeting in my diary without me knowing and I suddenly have to attend a meeting. So it was looking at all the meetings and either sending someone to deputize and summarize or to just say, I'm not needed here. I'm not going to come. So creating space by not going to anything extra. So those were some of the things that we worked on that were real sort of practical things that could be done.
Those are all really good things. And I think, intentionally blocking stuff out of my calendar and treating it as a meeting has been something that I've started doing as well for certain things. And I mean, admittedly, I still sometimes fall into the trap of like not being able to get to that work even when I have it blocked off. And I think, something that I've struggled with, which I'd be curious to get your feedback on around delegation, is there's an element of control that comes into play for me where I feel so passionate about every element of the Boon product that I want my hands on everything. So how do I gain comfort with relinquishing some of that control and knowing that everything is going to be okay? These are people that you ultimately trust, but just not being in control. I think that's something I struggle with. And I think especially when you have some of that imposter syndrome and fear of failure, fear of being a fraud, that comes to the forefront pretty closely.
Well, first of all, you are not alone. So that's the first thing to know. And I'm glad you used the T word, trust. It's so important.
Yeah.
You have people you work with and trust. And how can you also increase that level of trust? So if you give someone something to do, it's a two-way thing. They've got to trust you and you've got to trust them. But maybe while you're building that muscle of delegating, the more you do it, like any muscle, the easier it will become and more natural it will become. But while you're getting there, maybe you put in really solid expectations and checkpoints. So I work with people often and say, okay, so you're going to give someone something to do and you don't want to just have them come back in 2 weeks and find it's nothing like what you're expecting. So maybe you say, I'm going to set out some really clear expectations here. And I'd like you to check in with me on days 3, 8, and 12, whatever it might be. And that way, at least you have a bit of peace of mind and you can sort of run the process without having to do it yourself. It's like dropping your child off at childcare for the first time and it's half an hour, then it's 2 hours, and then it's the whole day. So it's sort of that kind of getting yourself used to it. And I often encourage leaders to be transparent and say to the people that report to them, look, I'm new to this and I'm learning. So if you think I'm hovering over you and micromanaging, tell me. And if you also I'm doing it for me, not for you. And so that kind of real openness can engender a lot of trust as well.
Wow. Boone team members, if you're listening to this podcast, you're hearing some of the internal struggles that I'm dealing with on a day-to-day basis.
I appreciate your openness.
Yeah. And I guess I think you've already given some really good nuggets here, but I guess, you kind of talk through some ways to get away from our to-do list in order to handle the big meaty stuff. I guess you might have people saying, well, then how do I ultimately get to those things on the to-do list that I am still ultimately responsible for? So how do you think about new managers being able to balance their workload while still feeling empowered to be able to do some of these more higher level strategic initiative type items while still making sure they're managing the day-to-day?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think it's about balance, and it's about making sure that you can pay a bit of attention to everything, so everything gets moved forward a little. And it can be about prioritization. So we have different tools that we walk people through when coaching, things like the Eisenhower matrix. So if people aren't familiar with it, it's a way of looking at tasks and prioritizing how important they are, and then using that to decide if and when you're going to do them. So the Eisenhower matrix, for instance, pits how urgent something is against how important it is. So if something's really urgent and important, you do it. You put it at the top of your list and you get to it first. If something's, my favorite is neither urgent nor important, because you can usually delete that or leave that at the bottom, or just sort of disappear into the ether at some point. You never have to think about it again. And if things are in the middle, you're going to decide, is this important enough that I want to do it later? In which case you can say, okay, next week I've got an hour and I'll do it then. Or it's something you can delegate and it will be a gift to someone else. Those are the kinds of ways.
Yeah, I love that. And I guess based on everything you've said today, I think, we always like to have our audience walk away with 3 things that if you're an employee in today's workplace, whether you might be an individual contributor thinking about different ways you could leverage your time. It doesn't just have to be a new manager or even a new leader in a new leadership position. I think there are various ways that this applies to different roles in the organization. And I think that one of the unique things about Boone is that we're able to kind of coach you through those unique ways that this is showing up for you personally. So I think, just as we're thinking about this podcast in particular, we always like to want to be able to show what are 3 tangible nuggets that new managers can walk away with. And I think you've already highlighted a bunch, but if you were to just boil it down, 3 basic things that as a new manager you can take back into your workplace tomorrow, what would they be?
Well, just 3. Okay, I'm thinking. So I would say delegate, learn to delegate. However that's going to look for you. Don't feel guilty about it. Learn to do it. Be fiercely protective of your time. So if they say in all these coaching books, if you don't decide what you're going to do with your time, someone else will. So be really, really protective of it and thoughtful about what you're going to do with it.
Love that.
And then I would say be realistic about what you can do in a day and set realistic goals and expectations for yourself and your team. So you are going to be the person setting the tone for the rest of your team. So if you're up at 4 a.m. emailing, everyone on your team's going to think that's appropriate too. So you are going to set the tone. So set really realistic, and by that I mean sustainable expectations. Sure, you might have a project that requires everyone to be up late for a brief period, but that's not an everyday solution to getting things done.
Yeah, and something that came up for me as you're talking about this is having realistic expectations with yourself as well. I think, I can be my own harshest critic. And I think sometimes I will look at my own to-do list and say like, oh my God, it's been 3 days and I've only gotten through like 2 or 3 items on here. And then, that can sometimes turn into like a spiraling effect. Oh, like I'm not being efficient with my time. I'm not being productive, all of those sorts of things. So I think being able to, be kind to yourself, that there are many different elements to your job. It's not just your to-do list. And I think that's a really good way of just being able to think about it. I think I can take some of that in my own day-to-day.
I think you raised such an important point, and that word grace is one that I use with clients all the time. So be how treat yourself how you would treat other people. If an employee came to you and said, "Oh, I only got this done," you'd say to them, "Yeah, but you've had a day full of meetings. Of course, you've only got that done." And so be as kind to yourself. And if you're a parent as well, I often think about how I might advise my child if they're in that situation, because we're so protective and kind to our children. We should be like just the same to ourselves.
That's right. And I imagine some of these recommendations may align with some of the things you're talking about for new managers or employees bringing back into their workplace. But I think for the HR leaders or the CEOs who are listening to this and thinking about setting that tone across their organization and being able to support their team more holistically, I guess what are a few things that you would point to from that lens of supporting new managers and being able to kind of scale this across the company?
Well, I would say setting clear expectations is really important. Having people know what their job is and what the scope is and what they're expected to do. I would say checking in with new managers regularly, whether that's in one-to-ones, whatever setting you have. And, really asking them, what do you need from me in order to be successful in your new role? And then getting them training. So leadership training. And I'd be crazy if I didn't say coaching. So coaching, leadership training. Coaching is brilliant for new leaders. It can help with what are your values. I do a lot of leadership, kind of new leader. What are your values? What are your strengths? What's your mission as a leader in general in life? Why do you even want to lead and be a leader? What kind of styles of leadership do you deploy in certain situations? When do you want to push this style forward? When do you want to pull it back? It can be really, really invaluable in speeding up that getting to know yourself as a leader process.
Yeah. And I think we found, and this is primarily where Boone operates, is like the small to mid-size organizations where it's an HR team of 1 to 3 people spread really thin. You don't typically have robust leadership training or managerial training services across the organization, and we serve as that kind of one-stop solution for what they're looking for there. So lucky to have amazing coaches like Rumina working with us. So I guess just lastly, Rumina, thank you so much for your time. I guess if listeners are looking to connect with you, how can they do that? You'd be lucky to work with Rumina, I can say firsthand, but how can they connect with you?
Thanks, Alex. Thank you for letting me gas back this day. That was an enjoyable time. So if you are interested, you could find me through Boone, and you can find me on LinkedIn. And I also have a website as well, which is sequinlife.com. So that's SEQUIN life.com.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for your time, Rumina. We will we'll be in touch, and you're the best.
Pleasure.